There were few detective stories that could surpass the true tale of the tracking of the miscreant malaria. For all time, the bringer of disease has been an evil genius, a vampire of the marsh, feeding upon its victim in the dead of night. Now the ghost was laid and the mystery was reduced to a few cells, which could be kept in a bottle and grown as tamely as gardeners rear cabbages. This speech, given to students at Aberdeen University by British surgeon Frederick Treves in 1906, sets the tone for our talk this evening. Treves uses the format of the detective story, lately made popular by Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, to characterize tropical medicine as a field capable of transforming ghosts into cabbages, in what is admittedly a bizarre analogy in domestic husbandry. In Holmes' story, the eponymous detective would reveal that what was previously thought to be supernatural, ghosts, was really just a few cells that with the right gardener might be grown tamely in a bottle. Appeals to detective work had become a common rhetorical strategy in medicine by the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. But what Treves also does, conveniently for our interest tonight, is employ the Gothic mode, referring to the parasitic disease malaria as a vampire of the marsh feeding upon its victim in the dead of night. Treves' use of the vampire was not a one-off oddity, but as we'll see, a metaphor that had cultural resonance in discussions of disease, particularly when it came to those diseases that abounded overseas and were spread by indeterminate transmission routes. Tonight, we're going to explore tropical medicine's investment in the Gothic mode, navigating a triptych of vampires, vectors, and revenge to arrive at the perhaps timely topic of Contagion Gothic. So first, vampires. Perhaps the most famous vampire is Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897. I suspect most of you here have probably read the novel, but even if you haven't, you're probably familiar with the story, so formative has it been to popular culture. Indeed, we're also familiar with the story, or think we are, that one of the things that often surprises people when they eventually read it is how much of the novel is taken up with the mundane, with legal observations about buying houses in London, ordnance survey maps, and the ins and outs of railway timetables. It's one of the ways in which the novel, though full of Gothic and supernatural goings-on, is hugely invested in the minutiae of everyday 19th century life. So my favourite review of the novel by a writer for the Leicester Chronicle demonstrates what I think is a very late Victorian approach to the supernatural, by confessing that as he turned the book's pages, which he fancied should have been written in blood, he found himself wondering, where were the police? So implicit here is that the horror of the vampire lies partly in the fact that what he's doing is most definitely against the law. Other reviewers dubbed the story too horrible for enjoyment and nausea-inducing, with one critic arguing that even a summary of the book would shock and disgust. Many warned nervous readers to avoid the tale entirely. Critics have read the anxiety produced by Dracula in countless ways. The basic premise: a foreign unknowable threat travels to England to prey on the helpless, notably women and children, of first Whitby and then London, and the mismatch between Dracula's apparent aristocratic status and his bestial proclivities make the Count a blank canvas for anxieties about immigration, foreign trade, women's changing place in the marriage market, fears that Britain's imperialism will come back to bite it, and as others have read it, late Victorian anti-Semitism. Another pertinent anxiety, though, for the purposes of our talk, is, of course, contagion. It's easy to map anxieties about disease transmission onto Dracula. He reproduces himself by infecting others with vampirism, who die after a prolonged period of sickness and then become vampires themselves. Thus, the Count is symbolic of both parasite and vector, pathogen and transmission route. Others have argued for Dracula as a metaphor for anxieties about plague, reading the rats that accompany him on his sea voyage in the context of the third plague epidemic, which reached Bombay in 1896, so the year before Dracula was published. The epidemic took up considerable space in the British medical and popular press, which debated whether or not rats were involved in its transmission. Two of Stoker's brothers were doctors stationed in India during the outbreak, which may well have influenced his artistic choices. At this point in history, the ontological status of creatures like rats were in flux, still associated with ideas about vermin, but also enjoying new currency as vectors of disease. Another disease that's been mapped onto Dracula is cholera. Stoker's mother witnessed the cholera outbreak in Ireland in the 1830s and purportedly told the bedridden Stoker horror stories as a child, which may have instigated a literary interest in the folk power of disease. He wrote a short story called The Invisible Giant in the 1880s, in which a vaporous giant besieges a city with illness, a story that Martin Willis has read as an earlier experiment in the Gothic power of disease to be more fully realized in Dracula. It's notable that contemporaneous reviewers also read Dracula as a metaphor for contagious disease, with one writer reporting, Count Dracula is a vampire of the most malignant kind. He carries contagion with him, noting that vampirism is propagated, like cholera, by contagion. So by this point in history, John Snow's Broad Street pump experiment in the mid-century had already established the waterborne transmission route of cholera. So although it was a readily available cultural reference, it isn't in fact a very good analogy for the vampire. I want instead to proffer another disease which maps much more convincingly onto the vampire, malaria. You see, like malaria, vampirism is a fever disease residing in the blood and transmitted via biting. Whilst modern adaptations make vampirism sexy and imagine the moment of puncture by the vampire's fangs as a stand-in for a different kind of penetration, I argue that his bite is much more similar to the bite of the blood-sucking mosquito. Just a few short months after the novel was published, a Scottish doctor called Ronald Ross would prove that malaria, the most high-profile disease of the British Empire, was transmitted by the bites of mosquitoes. So malaria, from the Italian malaria, or bad air, had for a long time been associated with marshy landscapes and turned soil. And this, again, is easy to map onto Dracula, who travels with boxes of Transylvanian soil and can transform into a white mist that enters rooms through keyholes, bringing to mind the unstoppable, because intangible, nature of disease. He even smells noxious, as several characters remark, gesturing towards the miasma theory that associated disease with bad smells. Other similarities between Dracula and malaria abound. Both the vampire and the mosquito are most active at night, and garlic, famously odious to vampires, is also a natural mosquito repellent. These shared characteristics might be explained by the vampire's role as a folkloric explanation for disease in pre-industrial societies. I mean, one can imagine waking up in the morning feverish and with mosquito bite punctures on your body. We can see how that may be attributed to the nightly visitations of a supernatural bloodsucker. But this is not simply a case of retrospective literary diagnosis. Dracula's entanglement with the etiology of malaria is also part of a very specific historical and cultural context. So Stoker's novel was indebted to two short stories that had come before: Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla and Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Good Lady Duquesne. In the former, the protagonist Laura becomes friends with a young woman called Carmilla, who, spoiler alert, turns out to be a vampire. Interestingly for us, her vampirism is explained as a fever, plague, and strange epidemic, and Laura even attempts to protect herself with a charm infused with an antidote for, you guessed it, malaria. Meanwhile, Braddon's short story, published the year before Dracula in 1896, follows a young girl, Bella, who travels to Italy to be a companion to a woman of uncommonly old age, the titular Lady Duquesne. In the story, mosquitoes are used as an explanation for Bella's increasing weakness. He's caught you on the top of a vein. What a vampire, insists Dr. Paravicini. You must always show me any bite of this nature. It might be dangerous if neglected. These creatures feed on poison and disseminate it. This literary moment gestures, even before its experimental confirmation, to circulating knowledge about the mosquito's potential as a vector for diseases like malaria. We soon learn, however, that the real culprit is Dr. Paravicini himself, who's been dosing Bella with chloroform and extracting her blood at night in a bid to prolong Lady Duquesne's life. The connection between vampires and malaria was thus already circulating in the medico-literary imagination. Indeed, what binds these three vampire tales is that they're all framed by medicine. The narrative of Carmilla is presented as a medical case study told by Dr. Hyselius. Good Lady Duquesne is, of course, primarily a story about untrustworthy doctors and medical experimentation. And Dracula frequently appeals to modern and experimental medicine with its sickbed scenes, blood transfusions, lunatic asylums, and crew of light, who many have read as symbolizing modern Western medicine versus Eastern superstition. It's just this tension, the tension between the rational and the supernatural, that gives late century Gothic its thrill. Contemporaneous reviewers characterized Dracula as a curious compound of realism and sensationalism, a story that dealt with possibility in impossibility. Thus, it has something in common with Michael Saylor's understanding of the new romance genre at the fin de siècle. This form, because genre is perhaps too strong a term, is characterized by stories that offer a modern form of escapism, whereby readers are enchanted by the gratification of their reason. So the prime example of this for Saylor is the Sherlock Holmes stories, which play on the deliciousness of the rational denouement, the satisfaction of the logical big reveal. This is also perhaps why the vampire makes such a good symbol for narratives of contagion. It fulfills the mythic role of explaining the inexplicable, vampires answer for the etiology of diseases like malaria. But the vampire also offers something more. It's able to express the intangible horror of the experience of illness, of the sense of dis-ease engendered by the power of unknowable nature. The vampire becomes a new romance-like figure in medical discourse at the turn of the century, with practitioners playing on the big reveal that scientific medicine has transformed the mythic vampire into the much more manageable collection of cells to be grown tamely in a bottle, as Treves insisted at the beginning of our talk. From the 1880s, mosquitoes and other insects were gaining traction as vectors of disease, and the vampire was invoked as a frame of reference in newspaper articles and travel guides, warning against the dangers of insect bites, a kind of shorthand that communicated the horror of disease, but also the power of modern medical science to slay such creatures. For example, in his presidential address to the Royal Institute of Public Health in Brighton, director of the London School of Tropical Medicine, Andrew Balfour, attributed the tropical disease trypanosomiasis to certain insects which love the darkness rather than the light, and like vampires, feed upon the blood of man. But we're not just dealing with the vampire as an analogy for the public understanding of science, or for the professional self-fashioning of practitioners. It also crops up as a way for practitioners to process their own experiences of illness and to think through the social and political stakes of the British imperial project. In 1911, while stationed in Nigeria with the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, British parasitologist John William Scott McPhee used the vampire as a guiding metaphor in a poem he wrote called The Vampire's Grave. This one is up on the blog if you're interested in reading the poem. So it begins by setting the scene for us. The lamplight flickers out, the last fire dies down, and the atmosphere is infiltrated by a formless fear as the vampire is beckoned from his shallow grave. Awake, awake, night plays the host, and bide you to your bloody feast. Drink and live till dawn dyes the east, Nigeria, accursed coast. Addressing the vampire, McPhee insists, you laugh to see the new men come, rich red blood pulsing through their veins, and you know with what enduring chains to bind them to their lingering doom. So here the vampire is a stand-in for parasitic disease. The men's lingering doom is chronic malaria. And this parallel is compounded by the line, do you instill the poison where you suck the lifeblood to your jaws, invoking, of course, the mosquito as vector, and like Stoker, imaginatively collapsing the two figures into one. McPhee laments the impact of chronic tropical illness on the health of Britons in imperial space. How have you fed your phantom life? How many heroes battened on, he asks. But there is hope. The 1,000 heaps of bleaching bone that rest on the coast of Nigeria are not in vain, because the whitethorn stake already wounds the vampire's breast. The fire is kindled, he writes, and implores Nigeria, awake. We might read this as an appeal for Nigeria to awaken from darkness and superstition and to embrace the light of Western medicine. But the Gothic mode here ultimately makes for an uncomfortable rendering of imperial space, making room for the intangible power of something more than disease. Like many of his contemporaries, McPhee perpetuates an understanding of Africa that naturalizes the supernatural. So this brings us to our second reading, an excerpt from a novel called With Edged Tools, published in 1894 by Henry Seton Merriman, the pen name of Hugh Stowell Scott. The story follows British gentleman Jack Meredith, who travels to Africa to make a name for himself and to secure the fortune that will allow him to marry his love interest against his father's wishes. Whilst there, he embarks on a business scheme to cultivate a secret African wonder drug called simiacine with British big game hunter Guy Osgard and West Indian trader Victor de Nervo, who we soon learn is the villain of the piece. The novel is haunted by anxiety that, as one character puts it, men go physically to the colonies and morally to the dogs. Here, Merriman is drawing on a broader anxiety embedded in colonial medical writing, that colonial space was physically and morally degenerating. Andrew Davidson's medical textbook, Hygiene and Diseases of Warm Climates, published the year before in 1893, for example, insisted that British children raised in India should be sent home to England around 7 or 8 years old, or they will deteriorate physically and morally. Not only will they be physiologically affected by the intemperate climate, but they'll also learn much that is undesirable from the local culture and inhabitants. It's much better that they be returned to the more bracing physical and moral climate of England. This sense of the unsuitability of Europeans for colonial space was widespread. And whilst many practitioners of tropical medicine sought to decouple social concerns from sanitary ones, the dominant narrative was one which justified the civilizing mission of Western imperialism by presenting the colonial encounter as one beset by disease and violence. So Merriman deliberately collapses these epidemiological and ethical concerns using the language of contagion. When we first meet Victor de Nervo, he's sickly, feverish, and impatient. His skin is jaundiced, and he's treating himself medicinally with a white powder in half a glass of water. And yet Merriman doesn't attribute his illness to one of the many epidemics mentioned in the story, cholera, smallpox, or malaria, but rather tells us that he's suffering from the irritability of Africa. The irritability of Africa was upon him. It gripped him remorselessly. No one knows what it is, but it is there, and sometimes it is responsible for murder. Inhaled into the white man's lungs with the air of equatorial Africa, it makes European gentlemen commit acts they blush to think of in after days. There are moral microbes in the atmosphere. In the language of germ theory, these moral microbes allow Merriman to cast tropical disease and violent behavior as issuing from the landscape at large, collapsing nature and culture into one. Such a rhetorical move both naturalizes violence in African space and creates a kind of emotional epidemiology that coincides with a long history of pathologizing the emotions and behaviors of colonized peoples. Merriman's metaphor of irritability plays on the dual meaning of the word to refer to the emotional violence associated with feeling irritable and to a neurological irritation, a medical term that underpinned many chronic conditions associated with ill health in this period. As well as the generalized foreboding engendered by Africa's irritability, Merriman also presents his readers with an encounter with a specific tropical disease, African sleeping sickness. Sleeping sickness, or human African trypanosomiasis, is a parasitic disease caused by a trypanosome parasite confined to a narrow geographical range in Western and Central Africa. Symptoms include fever, chills, pain, anemia, itching, a disrupted sleep-wake cycle, sliding into coma, and if left untreated, death. It's spread by the bite of a tsetse fly. However, this wasn't discovered until the turn of the century. So in the 1890s, the disease was considered rare, invariably fatal, and still very much shrouded in mystery. The excerpt that I shared on the blog is a pivotal scene in which Victor de Nervo dies rather melodramatically from the disease, the drama heightened by his recently mutilated face. So there are some quite graphic descriptions coming up just to warn everyone. As Gaiusgard shakes de Nervo's lifeless body, hoping to rouse him from a sleep that knows no earthly waking, de Nervo's mutilated inhuman head rolls on his shoulders, his round, lidless eyeballs staring. The narrator speculates that the sleeping sickness, a disease that we've been told earlier that he had lived in dread of contracting, was a kind of karmic retribution for de Nervo's crimes, in this case, keeping slaves under the guise of fair employment. But it's also framed as a divine concession to soften the blow of the punishment meted out by those slaves who a few pages earlier had carried out their own form of justice by shearing off de Nervo's ears and cutting away his lips and eyelids, leaving an eerie grin and eyes that will ironically never close again. Thus, readers are presented with a colonial encounter haunted by the dual horror of deadly disease and gory violence. Given the sensationalism of this portrayal of sleeping sickness, it may surprise you to learn, as it did me, that the Indian Medical Gazette referred their readers to with-edged tools as providing a good description of the disease. In fact, several newspapers and journals use the novel as a reference point when discussing outbreaks of sleeping sickness in Uganda at the turn of the century. In doing so, they perpetuated tropical epidemiologies that were enmeshed within discourses of revenge and superstition. The entanglement between sleeping sickness and superstition encoded by Merriman mirrors a broader circulating wisdom encoded in the imperial imagination. In his sensational travel narrative, 6 Years of Adventure in Congoland, published the year before with Edged Tools, Edward Glave describes a combat between two young warriors. The fighters presented a ghastly appearance, their bodies flooded with crimson and the ground beneath their feet saturated with their blood. The fight, he informed his readers, was started over a phrase, Owa Natan Tolo, which means, may you die of sleeping sickness. So dreaded is this disease that it's been embodied into one of Africa's bitterest curses, and no man expresses his hatred of another in this insulting form without first grasping his knife in readiness, as this utterance is a direct challenge to fight, and no one but a coward will fail to accept it. So the story was repeated in several clinical accounts of sleeping sickness, included in multi-volume textbooks on tropical medicine, and featured in 2 ethnographic accounts of the Congo, published in 1891 and 1910. Merriman's novel encapsulates the spirit of Owa Natan Tolo, perpetuating the idea of sleeping sickness as a violent curse. In the excerpt I shared, de Nervo's death is foreshadowed by the opening to the chapter, which begins, there are some places in the world where a curse seems to brood in the atmosphere. Msala was one of these. Perhaps these places are accursed by the deeds that have been done there. Enmeshed then within a language of curses, bad deeds, and retribution, the sleeping sickness takes on a supernatural quality in Merriman's novel as an extension of the power of tropical nature. Indeed, whilst readers might have been struck by the violence of the punishment meted out by the slaves, a yelling, laughing horde of torturers, Merriman endows his tropical illness with an equal capacity for horror. With the dread microbe of the sleeping sickness slowly creeping through his veins, Victor had fled the plateau and left a memento behind him, surer than their torturing knives, keener than their sharpest steel. He had left the sleeping sickness behind him. De Nervo's contagious legacy ensures that readers are left with an impression of the colonial encounter beset by the violence of exploitation, retribution, and deadly disease. Victor's death brings home to the reader the full horror of Owa na Ntolo. And this brings us to our final reading, a story that takes the legend of Owa na Ntolo and gives it the full Gothic treatment. Winged Death was published in a collection called Weird Tales in 1934. It was ostensibly ghostwritten by father of weird fiction H.P. Lovecraft in collaboration with American pulp fiction writer Hazel Held, who supplied the original idea. So by this point in history, it had been confirmed that sleeping sickness was spread by the bite of the tsetse fly, dispelling much of the mystery and superstition that surrounded the disease. In this story, however, we see the curse-like nature of sleeping sickness as alive and well, and its horror is transferred onto its insect vector. The narrative opens with 4 men, the hotel proprietor, a policeman, a coroner, and his physician, standing in a hotel room in Bloemfontein, South Africa. The narrator tells us that their horror is equally divided between the dead body in front of them, a journal in the physician's hand, a dead fly in a pot of ammonia, and some handwriting scrawled on the ceiling. The remaining narrative is taken directly from the journal, which belonged to the dead man, who is both victim and perpetrator of a murder. A lovely little Gothic mystery. So the story follows Dr. Thomas Sloanwitt, an American pathologist specializing in African fevers, who enacts a complicated scheme of revenge on a scientific rival, professor of invertebrate biology at Columbia University, Dr. Henry Moore. Many of you will have read it as it's up on the blog, so I won't do a full synopsis. But essentially, the scheme of revenge involves Sloanwitt crossbreeding to some tsetse flies and painting them with a blue dye to create what appears to be a new species. Sloanwitt then anonymously ships these crossbred tsetses to entomologist Moore, hoping to trick him into examining them. Thus, Moore will become infected with sleeping sickness and die, the perfect murder. However, during his experiments, Sloanwitt learns of a local belief that when tsetse flies bite, they take the souls of their victim. Although initially dismissing this as native superstition, Sloanwitt eventually comes to think that it might be true after being haunted by a tsetse fly that he believes contains Moore's soul. The story is told through Sloanwitt's diary entries, which become more and more erratic as the tale unfolds, and he begins to question his sanity. He recounts how the fly hovers over a copy of Moore's book on entomology, knocks on windows and doors, walks backwards around a clock, and begins a haunting countdown, dipping itself in ink and scrawling numbers on the ceiling. 5, 4, 3, 2. What can this be but some monstrous and unthinkable counting off of days, writes Sloanwitt. As the diary entries recede and we return to the frame narrative, the reader is faced with an interpretive dilemma. So now remember, we've got a dead body, a dead fly in a pot of ammonia, some writing scrawled on the ceiling, and of course, the diary. Sloanwitt's distrust of his own senses, constant references to his shaken mind, and even his handwriting, which we're told becomes irregular, nervous, and very difficult to decipher, makes us question the reliability of his narration. Thus, the ending with its dead body and accompanying paraphernalia can be interpreted in 2 ways. That the narrator has contracted sleeping sickness and the diary recounts his gradual mental deterioration as a result of the illness, or that he really was being hounded by a supernatural arthropod. The cause of death is noted by the coroner as heart failure induced by sheer fright. But he admits the presence of a tsetse fly bite on the back of Sloanwitt's neck, along with trypanosomes in his blood, keeping both possibilities in play. The writing on the ceiling, supposedly written by Sloanwitt in fly form, appears to corroborate his story. It reads, "See my journal, it got me first. I died, then saw I was in it. The blacks are right, strange powers in nature. Now I will drown what is left." The drowned fly in a pot of ammonia is alleged to be Sloanwitt's suicide after he realized that his consciousness had been transferred into the fly's body. The coroner asserts that the position of the writing is in a place no human hand could reach, which again appears to confirm the authenticity of the supernatural. In a narrative that refuses to fully confirm or negate the teller's perspective, the mysteries of Africa, articulated by native superstition, are pitted against and ultimately supersede scientific authority of Western biomedicine. From vampires to vectors to revenge, I've introduced you to just some of the ways that narratives of tropical medicine became entangled with the Gothic imagination at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. By the latter half of the 20th century, Contagion Gothic became dominated by the figure of the zombie and scaled up to epidemic or pandemic levels. In 1911, the CDC even produced a disaster preparedness campaign, which featured a fictional virus, Z1N1, and the resulting zombie apocalypse. Their spokesperson reasoned that if you're generally well equipped to deal with a zombie apocalypse, you'll be prepared for other kinds of disaster, like a hurricane, pandemic, earthquake, or terrorist attack. Contagion Gothic ultimately helps us to navigate the imaginative gap that scientific medicine doesn't quite manage to bridge. At the fin de siècle, it was immersed within ideologies of imperial conquest and haunted by unknowable epidemiologies that, despite our best efforts, refuse to be grown tamely. And I'll leave it there. A lot of this is drawn from my book, Empire Under the Microscope. So if you're interested in the more academic arguments behind some of these tales, then it is open access, and I encourage everyone to give it a look. Thanks very much.